I'd been left for dead on the Briar Creek Road with 2 rifle balls in me and my horse gone. And if you'd asked me that morning whether anyone in the territory would have dragged a stranger out of the snow and fed him the last food her children had, I'd have told you no. I'd have been wrong. The road agents hit me where the canyon narrows just past the Whitlock Ford. 3 of them, maybe 4, I never got a clear count. One stepped out of the junipers, and by the time I pulled my pistol I was already falling. They took my horse, my saddlebags, the Winchester, my coat, and the $40 in scrip I carried for travel. They left me face down in the gravel with the snow coming on. I don't know how long I lay there. The cold was the thing that kept me alive, I think, slowed the bleeding enough that I didn't drain out in the first hour. I remember crawling. I remember the fence posts of a homestead showing through the white like crooked teeth, and I remember thinking I'd reach them or I wouldn't, and either way the deciding was done. The woman found me at her gate. I learned her name later, Nettie Groves. A widow. 28 years old, maybe less, with a boy of 7 called Emmett and a girl of 5 called Lucille, and a homestead that was coming apart at the seams. Her husband, Deacon Groves, had died of the fever the winter before, and she'd held the place together through spring planting and summer haying, and the dry autumn that followed by nothing but will and the kind of pride that doesn't ask for help, because it doesn't believe help will come. She was hauling water from the well when she saw me. I know this because the bucket was still on its side in the yard when I came to on her kitchen floor, the water frozen in a dark sheet across the dirt. She dropped everything and come running. I was not a small man, 6'1", broad across and deadweight with the consciousness going in and out. She got me up somehow, got my arm across her shoulders and walked me 40 yards to the door and through it. I remember her voice, low and steady, not panicked, not gentle in the soft way, steady the way you talk to a horse that's going down and might still get up. "You're not dying in my yard," she said. "I won't have it." The cabin was one room with a loft, a potbelly stove with a crack in the firebox that leaked smoke, a table with one short leg shimmed with a folded newspaper, 2 children sitting on a bench against the far wall, the boy holding the girl, both of them watching me with the kind of eyes children get when trouble is the only thing that comes through the door anymore. She laid me on the floor by the stove and cut my shirt open with a kitchen knife. The ball on the left side had gone through the meat of my shoulder and out the back. The one on the right was still in me, low on the ribs. She heated water in a tin pot, tore a bedsheet into strips, and went to work with a darning needle and a pair of pliers she'd cleaned in the boiling water. "Hold still," she said. I held still, not because I chose to, because I couldn't do anything else. The pliers went in and the world went red and then white and then gone. When I came to, it was dark. The stove was ticking with heat. A tallow candle burned on the table and the 2 children were asleep in the loft, and Nettie Groves was sitting on a stool beside me with her hands in her lap, watching. "Both balls are out," she said. "You lost a good deal of blood, but neither one hit anything that won't mend. You'll want to stay flat for a day or 2. I tried to speak, and what came out was a croak. She brought me water in a cup with a chip on the rim. I drank and tried again. "Who are you?" I managed. "Nettie Groves, this is my place. Who are you?" "Caleb Strand." She didn't react to the name. I was glad of that, though I didn't know yet why it mattered. In the next territory over, Caleb Strand meant the Strand Cattle Company, 11,000 head, 40 riders, a house with glass windows and a cookhouse that served 3 shifts. Here, on the far side of the divide, it meant nothing. I was just a man bleeding on her floor. "You're going to need to eat," she said, and stood and went to the stove. I watched her move. She was thin, not slender, thin. The kind of thin that comes from feeding children first and yourself second, and doing that for months. Her dress was patched at both elbows, and the hem was frayed to threads. Her hair was dark and pinned up in a way that had started neat that morning and had come apart hauling a stranger across her yard. She moved with a kind of worn-down economy, no wasted motion, and when she opened the cupboard above the stove, I saw what was in it. Almost nothing: a quarter sack of flour, a tin of salt, a handful of dried beans in a jar, a single strip of jerked venison that might have been there since her husband died, no sugar, no coffee, no lard, a half-dozen shriveled potatoes in a crate on the floor. She took the venison, the last of the beans, 2 of the potatoes, and the flour, and she made a stew in the tin pot and biscuits on the stovetop, and the smell of it filled that one-room cabin like something holy. She fed the children first. She woke them quiet in the loft and brought them down and gave them each a bowl and a biscuit, and they ate the way children eat when they're hungry and have learned not to mention it. The boy, Emmett, watched me over the rim of his bowl with a look that was half suspicion and half something else. The girl just ate and didn't look at me at all. Then Nettie brought me a bowl and held it while I drank from the edge, because my hands were shaking too hard to hold it myself. "This is your last food," I said. She looked at me straight. "You needed it more." "The children." "I'll manage." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a plea. She said it the way she'd said, "You're not dying in my yard," as a fact about the world she intended to make true, whether the world agreed or not. I lay there with her stew in my belly and her strips of bedsheet around my ribs, and I thought about the 40 riders and the 11,000 head and the house with glass windows, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't name it then. I can now. It was shame. Not shame at what I'd done, shame at what I'd stopped doing. I'd stopped seeing people. I'd run my outfit like a counting operation for 3 years since Margaret died, and I'd looked at every person who crossed my path as a number, a hand to hire, a seller to haggle, a problem to solve. I hadn't sat at a table and eaten with another human being in longer than I could count. And this woman, who had nothing, truly nothing, not a figure of speech, had pulled me off the ground and given me the food her children needed. I slept. I woke with a fever and slept again, and for 2 days the world came and went in pieces. Nettie changed my bandages and kept the stove fed and kept water in me. I remember her talking to the children in the loft, her voice low, answering their questions. "Is he going to die, Mama?" "No. He's going to get better and go on his way." "Where did he come from?" "I don't know, somewhere else." "Is he mean?" A pause. "No, baby, he's just hurt." On the 3rd morning, the fever broke and I opened my eyes to daylight coming through the one window, and Emmett was standing at the foot of my pallet looking at me with his arms crossed, exactly the way a grown man does when he's sizing you up. "You snore," he said. "So I've been told." "Mama used up the last of the flour on your biscuits." "I know." He waited. Then he said, in a voice that was too old for 7, "She won't say so, but there isn't anything left." She was going to take the mule to Corwin's store and see if he'd trade her work for credit, but the mule's got a bad hoof and she can't ride it. I didn't say anything. He didn't seem to need me to. He delivered the information the way a man reports a fence down, and then he turned and went back to the loft. I sat up that morning. It nearly killed me, but I sat up. From the sitting position, I could see the whole of Nettie Groves's world, and it was a world that was ending. The stove had a crack. The roof had a sag over the loft where the ridgepole was rotting. The window had a rag stuffed in the corner where the glass had broken. The woodpile by the door was down to a dozen sticks. The yard beyond was bare packed dirt with a well that had a broken windlass and a chicken coop with 3 hens in it. And the fence I'd crawled to was leaning at 20 degrees. The barn, if you could call it a barn, held 1 lame mule and a milk cow so bony her hip bones stood out like tent poles. A plow rusted behind it. A small plot of turned ground showed where a kitchen garden had been, but the autumn had taken the last of it, and now it was just cold dirt. This woman had kept 2 children alive and a homestead standing for a year by herself, and she was losing. She was losing slowly and with her back straight, but she was losing, and there was nobody coming to help. She came in from the well. She'd rigged a rope and bucket to replace the broken windlass, and found me sitting up. "You shouldn't be moving." "I'm not moving, I'm sitting." She almost smiled, almost. "You'll tear the stitches." "Mrs. Groves." "Nettie. Nettie. You gave me your children's last food." I gave a hurt man what I had. It wasn't complicated. "Where's your nearest neighbor?" "The Fry's 4 miles east. They don't come by." She set the water bucket down. "There's a town, Corwin's Crossing, 9 miles north. I get there when I can." "Who helps you?" She looked at me the way you look at someone who's asked a question, so far from the reality of your life that you don't know how to explain the distance. "Nobody helps me, Mr. Strand. I help myself." It wasn't bitter. It was just true. And in that truth was a kind of iron that I recognized because I'd built my whole outfit on it, the belief that you do for yourself and you don't wait for anyone. The difference was, I'd done it with capital and crew and cattle. She'd done it with nothing. I spent 2 more days on that floor. Nettie fed me broth made from boiling the chicken bones she'd been saving. She fed the children the last of the potatoes. She ate nothing herself that I saw. On the evening of the second day, Lucille came down from the loft and walked over to my pallet with a solemnity that would have been comic in a child who wasn't hungry. She was carrying a rag doll with one button eye, and she set it down on the blanket beside me. "This is Josephine," she said. "She keeps the bad dreams away." "I appreciate it." "Mama says you're leaving tomorrow." "That's right." She looked at me for a long time with her mother's direct eyes. Then she patted Josephine's head and went back to the loft. The next morning, Nettie brought me a coat. It was a man's coat, worn brown canvas, lined with wool, the elbows patched with leather. It smelled of wood smoke and open air and a trace of something else, something personal that I understood without asking. "This was your husband's," I said. "You can't ride in your shirt sleeves. It's 20 degrees. "Nettie." "Take the coat, Mr. Strand." There was a line in her voice that was the same line she used for "You're not dying in my yard." A line that was not asking. I put the coat on. It fit well enough. The wool lining held the warmth against my bandaged ribs, and I stood there wearing a dead man's coat given to me by his widow who had nothing left, and the shame I'd felt that first night came back so hard I had to look away. She'd saddled the lame mule for me. I told her I'd walk, but she said the mule needed the exercise and she'd get it back. I think she meant for me to ride it to town and leave it at the livery, and she'd send Emmett for it when the weather cleared. She had it all figured. She'd planned my departure the way she planned everything, practically, without sentiment, expecting nothing in return. I climbed onto that mule with my ribs screaming and my shoulder aching and the dead man's coat around me, and I looked down at her. She was standing in the yard with Emmett on one side and Lucille on the other, and the 3 hens were scratching behind them, and the broken fence leaned, and the sky was iron. "Thank you," I said. "You'd have done the same." I wouldn't have, that was the thing. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, a year ago, I'd have ridden past. I'd have had my crew and my purpose and my grief, and I'd have ridden past a woman standing in a yard with hungry children and a leaking roof, and I'd have told myself it wasn't my concern. I rode the mule to Corwin's Crossing. It took 5 hours with the snow. I left the mule at the livery and paid the man there $1 to feed it grain and send it back to the Groves place when the road cleared. Then I went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to my foreman, Hector Ruiz, at the Strand Ranch. 12 words, that's all it took. I wrote, "Send 12 wagons Briar Creek Road, Groves Homestead, full provisions, lumber, stop." Then I sat in the boarding house in Corwin's Crossing for 2 days while the stitches in my ribs pulled, and the bruise on my shoulder turned from purple to green. And I thought about Nettie Groves and her 3 hens and her dead husband's coat, and the rag doll named Josephine. And I tried to tell myself that sending the wagons squared the debt, and I could go home now. It didn't work. The Strand Ranch was 6 days' ride west. I'd built it from a quarter section and 40 head into the biggest outfit in the Cimarron drainage. Not by kindness, not by luck, by work that never stopped and a grief that I channeled into acquisition the way some men channel it into whiskey. Margaret had died of the fever in our second winter, before the house had glass in the windows, before the herd broke 1,000, before any of it meant anything. I'd buried her on the hill above the creek, and I'd kept building because I didn't know how to stop, and I'd turned into something I didn't recognize, a man who ran an empire and couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal he tasted. Hector wired back. Wagons loaded leaving tomorrow. What happened? I wired nothing, send them. I knew what the wagons would carry. Hector was the best foreman in the territory. He'd load flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, tinned peaches, dried apples, beans, cornmeal, lard, a side of bacon, molasses, vinegar, and soap. He'd add lumber, good milled boards, not the scrub timber they used for fence rails. He'd send nails, hinges, a new stovepipe, glass panes, rope, canvas, tools. He'd send a milk cow that wasn't a skeleton and a half-dozen laying hens that actually produced. He'd do it right because Hector always did it right. And I knew it wasn't enough. Not because the provisions were short, because the gesture was. A rich man sending wagons to a poor woman is the easiest thing in the world. It costs him nothing he'll miss. The woman who pulled me off the ground and gave me the food her children needed, that cost her everything. The asymmetry of it ate at me like the wound in my ribs, and I couldn't send enough wagons to balance it because the balance wasn't in the goods. It was in the giving. On the third morning in Corwin's Crossing, I went to the general store and bought a coat. A good one, sheepskin-lined, new, warm. I folded Deacon Groves's coat and wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with twine. Then I bought a horse, a big dun gelding, sound and steady, and I rode south on the Briar Creek Road. I told myself I was returning the coat. I told myself I'd stay an hour. I told myself a lot of things in those 9 miles, and none of them held up against what I already knew, which was that I was going back because that cabin with the leaking roof and the cracked stove and the widow who gave everything away was the only place in the territory where I'd felt like a human being in 3 years. I reached the homestead at midday. The yard was the same, bare, cold, the fence leaning. But the mule was back from the livery, standing in the barn with hay in the rack. The livery man had sent grain, and Nettie had carried it herself. And smoke was coming from the stovepipe, and Emmett was in the yard splitting kindling with a hatchet that was too big for him. He saw me coming up the road and stopped mid-swing. "Mama," he called, not taking his eyes off me. The man came back. Nettie came to the door. She was wearing the same patched dress, and her hair was pinned the same way, and she looked at me on my new horse in my new coat with the brown paper package under my arm, and something crossed her face that I couldn't read. "Mr. Strand, I brought your husband's coat back, and I hesitated. I sent some supplies, wagons. They should be here in a day or 2. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't help you for payment." "I know. I don't take charity." "It's not charity." "Then what is it?" I sat on that horse and looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years I said something honest. "I don't know, Nettie. I just know I could not come back." She studied me. Then she said, "Get down off that horse before you tear your stitches again. There's coffee. I borrowed some from the Fries." She'd walked 4 miles in the snow to borrow coffee from neighbors who didn't visit her. That was who she was. I dismounted and I walked into that cabin, and Lucille was sitting at the table with Josephine the rag doll, and she looked up at me and said, "You brought Josephine back." The doll was still on the pallet where she'd left it. I picked it up and handed it to her. "She kept the bad dreams away," I said. "You were right about that." The wagons came 2 days later. 12 of them, just as I'd wired, driven by 6 of my men with Hector Ruiz in the lead on his Grulla mare. They came up the Briar Creek Road in a line that stretched a quarter-mile, and Nettie stood in the doorway and watched them come, and her face did something I will remember until I die. It went through disbelief and confusion, and something that might have been anger, and then something that was none of those things and all of them at once. Hector pulled up in the yard and tipped his hat. He was a man of about 50, with a mustache like a horseshoe and manners that could have come from a drawing room. "Ma'am, Hector Ruiz, Mr. Strand asked us to bring a few things." "A few things, 12 wagons full." Nettie looked at me. I was standing by the barn where I'd been since dawn, replacing the hinge on the door. "Mr. Strand," she said, and her voice had that line in it again, the line that wasn't asking. A word. I followed her around the side of the cabin, out of earshot of the men and the children. The snow was falling lightly, and her breath came in small white plumes, and she stood with her arms crossed and her chin up and said, "I cannot accept this. It's already here. Then it can go back. Nettie, I am not a debt you owe. I pulled a man out of the snow. Any person with a spine would have done the same. You don't owe me 12 wagons for common decency." "You're right," I said. "I don't owe you 12 wagons. I don't owe you anything because what you did can't be owed. You gave a stranger everything you had left, and your children went hungry so I could eat. And you did it without asking a thing. And I have 40 riders and 11,000 head of cattle, and a house with glass windows. And I haven't given a single thing to anyone in 3 years because I forgot how." She was quiet. "You reminded me," I said. "That's not a debt. I don't have the word for it. But I couldn't go home and sit in my house and know that you and those children were 9 miles from starving because you gave your food to me. I couldn't do it." She looked at the ground for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I don't need saving, Mr. Strand." "I know you don't. And if you think this is the beginning of some arrangement, or the rich man rides in and—" "It's not. Because I have managed. I have managed for a year, and I will manage for another, and I don't need a man to come in here and—" "Nettie," I took a breath, "I'm not here to save you. I'm here because sitting in that boarding house in Corwin's Crossing was the loneliest I've been since I buried my wife, and the only time I wasn't lonely in 3 years was lying on your kitchen floor eating your last stew." She looked at me then, really looked at me, not the sizing up look, not the defensive look, something open, something careful. "Your wife," she said. "Margaret, 3 years ago. The fever. I'm sorry." "So am I," I pulled in a breath. "I built everything after she died, and none of it means what it was supposed to mean, and your boy told me you had nothing left, and I thought, if I can't use what I've built to help someone who actually deserves it, then what was the point of building it?" The snow came down between us. She uncrossed her arms. "The provisions can stay," she said. "But you understand this isn't charity and it isn't courtship. It's a man returning a kindness, and that's all." "That's all," I said. She went back around the cabin and told Hector to unload the wagons. I will tell you what was in those wagons because the specifics matter. 200 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of sugar, a 20-pound sack of coffee beans, salt pork bacon, tinned peaches, dried apples, cornmeal, lard, molasses, vinegar, baking soda, and 5 pounds of soap. That was the first wagon. The second carried lumber, milled pine boards, cedar shingles, oak for a new ridgepole. The third had nails, hinges, a new stovepipe, 3 panes of window glass, a coil of rope, a canvas tarp, a new windlass for the well, and a toolbox with a handsaw, a plane, a brace and bit, a level, and a square. The fourth had a milk cow, a good shorthorn, young and healthy, and a half-dozen Rhode Island red hens and a rooster. The fifth had seed, winter wheat, rye, and early peas for spring planting. The sixth through the 10th had fence posts, barbed wire, a new plow blade, a harness for the mule, and enough hay and grain to feed the livestock through winter. The 11th had blankets, 2 bolts of cloth, a pair of boots in what I guessed was Nettie's size, and a pair of small boots each for Emmett and Lucille. The 12th had a rocking chair. I don't know why I sent the rocking chair. Hector told me later that when I wired him I'd said provisions and lumber, and he'd added the chair himself. Every house needs one, he said, and he was right. Nettie watched the unloading with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face very still. Emmett stood beside her, and his eyes were wide and his mouth was open, and Lucille was holding Josephine and whispering to the doll, explaining each item as it came off the wagon. Those are chickens, Josephine, and that's a cow, she's pretty. And when the rocking chair came off the last wagon, Nettie put her hand over her mouth and turned away, and I pretended I didn't see. Hector and the boys stayed the night. They slept in the barn with their bedrolls, and the next morning before they left, Hector pulled me aside. "Boss, how long are you staying?" "A day or two. I want to fix the roof." He looked at me. Hector had been with me since before Margaret. He'd helped me dig her grave. He knew what I'd become in the 3 years since the counting, the distance, the machine. "The roof," he said. "It's got a bad ridgepole." "Caleb, you haven't fixed anything with your own hands in 2 years. You have men for that." "Not here, I don't." He adjusted his hat and looked at the cabin, and then at Nettie, who was carrying water from the well with the new windlass already installed, and then back at me. "I'll check the South Range and come back in a week. If you need anything, send the boy to Corwin's Crossing and wire me." He rode out with the empty wagons and the 5 hands, and I was alone with Nettie Groves and her 2 children, and a homestead that needed everything done. A day or two, that's what I told Hector, that's what I told myself. I stayed 7 weeks. The first thing I did was the roof. I pulled the rotting ridgepole down and replaced it with oak, and I laid the new cedar shingles and patched the loft floor where the water had warped the boards. It took 3 days. Emmett watched from the yard, and on the second day he climbed the ladder and handed me shingles without being asked. "You know how to use a hammer," I said. "Some." "Hold the shingle flat, hit the nail straight, don't hit your thumb." He hit his thumb twice and didn't cry either time. He was 7 and he had calluses. The second thing I did was the stove. I pulled the cracked firebox, patched it with a piece of iron from the barn, and ran the new stovepipe straight and true through the roof. That first evening, with the stove drawing properly and no smoke leaking, Nettie stood in the middle of the cabin and breathed in and said, "I'd forgotten what clean air smells like." The third thing was the well. The windlass Hector's men had installed was solid, but the well casing was cracked and the water had a muddy taste. I spent a day down in the well with a trowel and a bucket of clay, sealing the cracks, and when I came up Nettie handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You smell like a grave." "Your well disagrees with me." "My well disagrees with everyone. Deacon used to say it was the most contrary hole in the territory." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband's name to me since giving me his coat. She said it naturally, without the careful weight some widows put on the name, and I understood that Deacon Groves was not a wound she was hiding, but a fact of her life she carried openly, the way she carried everything straight and without apology. The fourth thing was the fence. I spent 4 days on the fence, and Emmett spent them with me, and by the end of it the boy could set a post and string wire and measure a span by eye. He was good with his hands. Deacon had taught him some before the fever, and the rest he'd learned the way frontier children learn everything, by watching and by need. It was during the fence work that Lucille began talking to me. She'd been quiet, watching from the porch with Josephine, but on the 3rd afternoon she walked out to where I was digging a post hole and stood there until I stopped. "Mr. Strand." "Lucille, are you staying forever?" I leaned on the post hole digger. "No, sweetheart, I'm just fixing some things." "Mama said you're going back to your ranch." "That's right." "Is your ranch far?" "Pretty far." She considered this. Then she said, "My papa went far away too." I didn't have an answer for that, so I just looked at her. She looked back at me with her mother's direct gaze, and then she set Josephine on the fence post and said, "She can watch you work," and went back to the porch. That was the moment I knew I was in trouble. Not the good kind of trouble, and not the bad kind. The kind where the ground you've been standing on turns out to be thinner than you thought, and something underneath is opening, and you can either step back to solid earth or you can let it open and see what's there. I let it open. Nettie cooked, with real provisions in the cupboard and a stove that drew properly and a cow that gave milk. She cooked the way some people sing, with a competence so deep it looked effortless. Biscuits and gravy in the morning, stew with real meat at midday, cornbread and beans and bacon at supper, with tinned peaches for the children and coffee for the adults. I ate at her table and she ate at her table, and we sat across from each other, and talked the way two people talk when they've been alone too long and have forgotten the rhythm of it. She told me about Deacon, a good man, a hard worker, a quiet laugher. He'd filed the homestead claim and built the cabin with his own hands and planted the first garden and dug the well, and then the fever had taken him in 4 days, and she'd buried him behind the barn where the cottonwoods grew. "He didn't leave me poor on purpose," she said. "He left me poor because that's what the frontier does. He'd built the best he could and it wasn't enough, and then it was just me." "You've done well." "I've survived, that's not the same thing." I told her about Margaret. I hadn't spoken her name aloud to anyone but Hector in 3 years, and it came out rough, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a long time. The hinges complained, but I opened it. "She wanted children," I said. "We were going to have children and a garden and a house with a porch. And then she was gone and I built the house and the ranch and everything else. And there's no garden and no children and no porch that means anything, because the person who was supposed to sit on it is buried on the hill." Nettie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Do you think she'd like who you've become?" Nobody had asked me that. Not Hector, not the banker in town, not the cattleman I did business with. Nobody. "No," I said. "Then maybe you should become someone she would." I fixed the barn next. New door, new hinges, new stalls. I repaired the chicken coop and built a proper roost and a laying box for the new hens. I mended the plow and sharpened the blade and oiled the harness. I split enough firewood to last 3 months and stacked it along the south wall of the cabin where the snow wouldn't reach it. And every evening I sat at Nettie's table and ate her cooking and talked to her children, and something in me that had been locked for 3 years was opening, and I couldn't have stopped it if I'd tried. Emmett warmed slowly. He was cautious. He'd had one man leave him already, and he wasn't about to let another one in without testing him first. He tested me the way boys do, by watching, by questioning, by small challenges. Could I rope? Could I shoot? Did I know how to track a deer? Could I whistle through my teeth? I could do all of those things, and I showed him each one, and with each one a small door in him opened an inch more. By the 3rd week he was following me around the homestead the way a colt follows a lead horse, not tethered, but choosing to stay close. Lucille was different. She'd made her decision the first day and hadn't wavered. She talked to me as though I'd always been there, and she included Josephine in every conversation. And one evening she climbed into my lap while I was sitting in the rocking chair. The rocking chair Hector had sent, which Nettie had placed by the stove and sat in every evening and hadn't commented on, and fell asleep with her head on my shoulder. I sat very still. I looked at Nettie. She was at the table mending a shirt, one of Emmett's, and she was watching me over the needle, and her eyes were bright. "She does that with everyone," Nettie said. "No, she doesn't." Nettie looked down at her mending. "No, she doesn't." The 5th week, something happened. I was in the barn fitting a new latch when I heard a wagon on the road. I came out and saw a man I didn't know, a heavy-set man in a good coat, driving a spring wagon with supplies in the back. He pulled up in the yard and tipped his hat to Nettie, who'd come out of the cabin. "Mrs. Groves, I heard you had some trouble this autumn. I brought you a few things, flour, coffee, some cloth, on behalf of the congregation." He was from the church in Corwin's Crossing. He was well-meaning. And he looked at Nettie the way a lot of people had looked at her, I suspected, with pity. The charitable gaze, the poor widow look. Nettie's spine straightened by an inch. It was already straight, but it found another inch. "That's kind of you, Mr. Hewitt, but as you can see, I've been provided for." He looked around the yard, the new fence, the repaired barn, the stacked firewood, the healthy cow in the paddock. And then he looked at me, standing by the barn with a hammer in my hand, and his eyebrows went up. "I see that," he said. "Well, the offer stands if you need anything." "I'll manage," Nettie said, and there it was again, the iron. After he left, I said, "He was just being kind." "I know, and I appreciate it. But there's a difference between kindness and pity, and he's never learned it." "Is that what you think I'm doing, pitying you?" She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd come back, her guard was fully down. "No," she said, "I think you're hiding." "From what?" "From the empty house with the glass windows and the buried wife and the 11,000 head of cattle that don't keep you warm at night. I think you came here because it's easier to fix my roof than to fix whatever's broken in you, and I think you're going to have to go home eventually and face it." I set the hammer down. "You're right. I know I'm right. But that's not the only reason I'm here." She waited. "I'm here because you're the most remarkable person I've ever met, and I'm watching you raise 2 children alone on a failing homestead with nothing but your will. And every morning I wake up and the first thing I think about is whether the stove is drawing and whether the children had enough breakfast. And I haven't thought about anyone besides myself in 3 years." She looked away. Then she said, "Mr. Strand." Caleb, I am not going to be the woman who falls into the arms of the first man who brings her flour. I know. I am not going to be someone's rescued widow. I rescued myself. I was rescuing myself when you arrived, and I'll go on rescuing myself after you leave." "I know that too." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm not asking anything. I'm telling you that I'm going home next week, and I'm going to sit in my house with the glass windows, and it's going to be empty, and I'm going to know that 9 miles from here a woman is sitting by her stove in a rocking chair she didn't ask for, and I'm going to wish I was there instead." She was quiet for a long time. The snow came down. A hen scratched in the yard. Emmett's hatchet rang from behind the barn where he was splitting kindling. "Then maybe," she said, "you should figure out a way to be in both places." I went home. I rode the 6 days back to the Strand Ranch, and I walked into the house with the glass windows, and it was exactly what she'd said, empty. Not of furniture or provisions or warmth. Empty of the thing that makes a house a home, which is someone waiting in it. I stood in the parlor that Margaret had never lived to see finished, and I looked at the walls and the floors and the glass in the windows, and I understood what Nettie had told me. I hadn't built this for Margaret. I'd built it instead of grieving for her, and the difference was everything. I spent 2 weeks at the ranch. I met with Hector and the hands. I settled the winter accounts. I made arrangements, careful ones, because what I was planning required care. Then I rode back to Briar Creek. When I came up the road, Emmett was in the yard. He saw me and he dropped his hatchet and ran for the cabin. "Mama," he came back again. Nettie came to the door. She saw me and she leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms and said, "You look like you've made a decision." "I have." "Let me hear it." I dismounted and stood in her yard, the yard I'd fixed, the fence I'd built, the barn I'd repaired, and I said, "I've asked Hector to take over the daily running of the ranch. He's been doing it anyway. I want to be here. Here, if you'll have me, not as a debt repaid, not as charity, not as a man who's saving you because you don't need saving and we both know it, As a man who wants to build a life with a woman he respects more than anyone he's ever known if she'll let him. She was quiet. She looked at me with those level eyes. Then she said, "I have conditions." "Name them." "This is my homestead. Deacon filed the claim and it's mine, and I'll not be signed off it." I wouldn't ask. "The children are mine. They call you what they choose to call you, and you answer to it, and you never try to be someone you're not to them." "Agreed. And if I marry you, it's because I choose to. Not because you're rich and not because I'm poor and not because you fixed my roof. Because I choose to. That's the only way I'd want it." She uncrossed her arms. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Come inside, Caleb. Coffee's getting cold." I went inside. Lucille was at the table with Josephine, and she looked up at me and said, "Are you staying this time?" "Yes." "Good." Josephine was worried. Emmett came in behind me. He stood in the door and looked at me and then at his mother, and whatever he saw on her face answered the question he hadn't asked. He walked over to the stool by the stove and sat down and said, "Can you teach me to rope a calf tomorrow?" "First thing." We married in the spring. The Reverend Caldwell came from Corwin's Crossing and performed the ceremony in the yard under the cottonwoods, with Emmett standing as witness and Lucille holding Josephine, and the 3 hens scratching in the dirt behind us, and the milk cow watching from the paddock with mild interest. Hector came, and he brought 4 of the hands, and they sat on their horses in a line and watched. And when the Reverend said the words, Hector took off his hat and held it over his heart, and I saw that his eyes were wet. Nettie wore a dress she'd made from the cloth in the wagons, blue calico with white buttons. She'd pinned her hair up properly, and there was a wildflower in it that Lucille had picked that morning. And she held my hand and said the words in her clear, steady voice, and I said them back. And the contract between us was sealed, not by the words and not by the law, but by the fact that she chose me freely, and I chose her. And neither of us needed the other to survive, but both of us wanted the other to live alongside. The homestead became something else, not the failing place it had been, and not the empire I'd left, something between. I kept the Strand Ranch running through Hector, and I worked the Groves homestead with my own hands. I plowed and planted and mended fence and tended cattle and split wood and dug a new root cellar and built a porch on the front of the cabin, a proper porch with a rail and 2 chairs. Nettie's garden came back. The kitchen plot that had been cold dirt bloomed with beans and squash and tomatoes, and she canned enough to fill the root cellar, and for the first time since Deacon died, there was enough. Emmett grew. By the end of that first year he could rope and ride and set a fence post and shoe a mule, and he called me sir and sometimes Caleb and once by accident Pa, and then went red and looked away, and I said, "I heard that," and he said, "It slipped," and I said, "It can slip whenever it wants," and he didn't look away again. Lucille grew too, but she'd never had the caution Emmett had. From the first she claimed me the way children claim, with the absolute certainty that this person belongs to them, and the matter was settled. She sat in my lap in the rocking chair most evenings, and Josephine sat with us, and sometimes she narrated to the doll what was happening in the room. Caleb's drinking his coffee, Josephine, and Mama's smiling again, Josephine, and the running commentary was the sound of a home. Mr. Hewitt from the church came by once more, that first spring. He saw the porch and the garden and the new fence and the cattle in the meadow, and he saw me on the porch with coffee in my hand, and Nettie beside me in the rocking chair, and the children playing in the yard, and he tipped his hat and said, "Well, Mrs. Strand, is it?" "Nettie," she said, "just Nettie." "Well, Nettie, it appears things have worked out." "They have." He looked at me. I looked back. He nodded once and drove on, and Nettie leaned over and said, quietly, "He still doesn't know the difference between kindness and pity. Give him time." "I've been giving him time for 2 years." "Give him more." She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, a real laugh, not the almost smile she'd given me on the kitchen floor, and it was like hearing water after a drought. And I sat on that porch with that sound in my ears and understood that the 11,000 head and the glass windows and the 40 riders hadn't been wrong. They just hadn't been enough. They were the frame. This, the porch, the garden, the woman's laugh, the children in the yard, the old mule twitching flies in the barn, this was what went inside the frame. I still have the coat, Deacon Groves's coat. Nettie never asked for it back, and I never gave it away. It hangs on a peg by the door, and sometimes when I come in from the cold I reach for it by habit, and the wool lining still holds warmth, and I think of the woman who gave it to a stranger because she had nothing else, and the nothing was enough. That's the thing I learned on Nettie Groves's kitchen floor with 2 bullets in me and her last stew in my belly. Kindness is not a transaction. It doesn't keep a ledger. It doesn't ask what the return will be. It gives because giving is what it is, and the return, when it comes, is not a payment but a recognition. I see you. I see what you did. I see who you are. Let me show you who I can be because of it. She fed a dying stranger her children's last meal. A week later, 12 wagons rolled into her yard. But the wagons aren't the story. The wagons are just what a man sends when he has more cattle than sense and less courage than he needs. The story is what came after the man himself, standing in her yard saying, "I could not come back," and the woman with her iron spine and her level eyes saying, "Come inside, Caleb, coffee's getting cold." That was enough. That has always been enough. I'm an old man now, and I sit on the porch she let me build, and the cottonwoods are tall, and Emmett runs the place with his wife and their children, and Lucille married a good man from Corwin's Crossing and brings him out on Sundays, and Josephine the rag doll sits on the mantel above the stove with her one button eye, retired but not forgotten. And Nettie sits beside me in the rocking chair that Hector sent, and sometimes in the evenings when the light goes gold across the valley, she puts her hand on mine and says nothing, and I say nothing, and the quiet between us holds everything we've built and everything we were given and everything we gave, and it is warm, and it is enough, and if I could go back to that road where they left me bleeding, I would crawl to her gate again. Every time, without hesitation. Because what I found there, what she gave a stranger from nothing, was worth more than everything I'd built without it. The gate is still crooked, by the way. I fixed it twice and Emmett fixed it once, and it leans. Nettie says it's the only thing on the place with character. I let it lean.